Inner Temple Roundtable on Race. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for joining the debate. I'm Judith Vaughan, Associate Professor and Head of Department at St Mary's University. The idea for this roundtable arose after a conversation I had with Celia Pilkington, archivist at the Inner Temple, following an exhibition we organised on women in law. It turned out that many people had also thought of this idea. Dominic Carrington, with whom I organised a conference with on race and the law in 2018, and all the archivists at the other Inns of Court. So we have joined together to focus on the importance of diversity at the bar, and also to launch a project that will record and promote the lives of forgotten early BAME lawyers. There have always been BAME members of the bar, and this history needs to be brought to the fore. My role today is purely one of facilitator. So just a few housekeeping rules. The day is being recorded. Questions will take place at the end of the day, save for Professor Thomas's, who, because of his work commitments, can only join us for his talk. So we would take any questions for him immediately after he has spoken. Please use the Q&A function if you have a question, and I will put your questions to the panel at the end. There's also a chat function that you can use if you want to raise issues or join the debate, but please use the Q&A for questions. And please also bear with us if there are any technical issues. There really shouldn't be. But before I begin, I really want to thank Celia, Henrietta, Rosie and Kate from the Inner Temple for their enthusiasm and work in putting this day together. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our chair, Master Kadri, who will also give our plenary paper. Master Kadri QC is one of the foremost criminal immigration barristers in the UK and Pakistan. He joined the chambers of David Barclay QC at 3 Paper Buildings in March 2019. He combines a public law practice in the UK as well as in Karachi, Pakistan. He has conducted many high-profile cases, regularly appearing both in the High Court and the Court of Appeal, and on several occasions appeared in the House of Lords, now of course the Supreme Court. He regularly advises on judicial reviews and on public law issues, immigrants' rights, and challenging the powers of authorities to deport immigrants. He will sometimes act pro bono in deserving cases. So I introduce Master Kadri QC. Thank you.
It was an honor to be asked by Celia to chair the morning session of today's conference. I would like to get the ball rolling with a brief account of my own experiences by talking about the racism in the bar between the 60s and 80s. But all my preparations have made me realize how hugely the bar has changed. Lawyers from ethnic minorities aren't just more visible. They have a range of talents and a confidence that didn't exist in my days. For that reason, it will be fascinating to hear from the 3 panelists who are to speak after me. They are, first, Leslie Thomas, a QC at Garden Court Chambers, with a very broad practice and a strong sideline as a professor of Gresham College. After that, we'll hear from Bibi Badijo. Called in 2005, she is a barrister specializing in matrimonial law at 4 Bricks Court. Ayola Solanki will then address us. She is an academic, bencher of the Inner Temple, and holds a chair in the EU law at the University of Leeds. Each has a unique outlook, and the ways in which we differ will be at least as interesting as the points on which we agree. Diversity isn't just an empty word. If it is to have meaning, the variety of non-white perspectives needs to be fully appreciated. My own formative experiences date from a time that is now very distant, and many of the challenges I am going to describe have been overcome. But to coin a phrase from younger days, the struggle continues. Addressing this conference via Zoom, more than 50 years since my career began, even I find it strange to look back. To you in the audience, the world where I started must be even harder to imagine. In the 60s, thousands of people were studying for the bar at any given time, and three-quarters of them were from Asian, African, or Caribbean countries. That wasn't just because being a barrister carried prestige in the Commonwealth. There were practical reasons too. To start the qualification process, all you needed was a degree from your own country. And part 1 of the two-stage exam could be completed gradually. You could study in your spare time. The money you could earn from casual job was enough to cover the relatively low fees. I myself got going soon after arriving in the UK from Pakistan in 1961. At the age of 24, I was already politically minded. I had been jailed for almost 6 months for leading a student movement against the military dictator Ayub Khan. But in one respect, I was starry-eyed. Many of the people who had pushed hardest for independence on the subcontinent, including Gandhi, Nehru and Jinnah, had also come to England at an early stage in their lives to gain admission to the bar. That meant that I associated the legal profession with progress. But though Commonwealth citizens like me were keen on qualifying, graduates from British universities had huge advantage. They had access to tutorials run by the Council for Legal Education, which were closed to foreigners who effectively had to teach themselves. Things got even tougher in 1964 with the rule change that disallowed retakes of a paper after the fourth attempt. That might sound reasonable, but it wasn't, because British graduates had decent classes and tutors. Their pass rates were about 6 times better than those of Commonwealth students. Allowing unlimited retakes wasn't a perfect solution, but it did mitigate the unfairness. I didn't fail any of my papers, thankfully, but to support my young family, I spent several years doing different jobs before I finally started the bar final course in 1968. Despite the handicaps facing Commonwealth students, I have to say that at that stage, the scale of indirect discrimination wasn't yet obvious to me. This wasn't due to ignorance. I had been a very active member in the UK's first civil rights organisation, the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination. And Enoch Powell's notorious Rivers of Blood speech had recently shown just how acute racial tensions were. But I had always admired the bar. The idea that the legal profession itself might be systematically racist was almost unimaginable. That perspective changed when I got to the bar school. As I've said, I was an experienced activist, and the political atmosphere was volatile. Protests had been rocking Western cities from Paris to Chicago. London itself had recently seen a major demonstration against the Vietnam War. Inspired by a student strike at London School of Economics, I soon participated in the formation of a bar students' reform committee. We staged a sit-in to demand improved educational facilities, suspension of the 4 retakes rule, and a right to unionize. It wasn't a resounding success. After 2 days, all that the Inns conceded was that we could create associations. They didn't like the word unions. But that produced a personal victory, in that I was then elected as the first president of the Inner Temple Students Association. The first clash with the legal establishment affected me a great deal. The only immediate consequence was that I lost my part-time job as a newsreader with the BBC Urdu service. But I also lost my naivety. It now began to dawn on me that the history of the English bar was inherently racist. I realized that wise barristers were the only one who ever took silk in the British Empire. And though Gandhi had been an enthusiastic bar student, his later heroism had hardly been honoured by the Inner Temple's decision to disbar him in 1922. The bar's claim to be inclusive was superficial, skin deep, you might say. Though the bar had always been happy to admit non-white lawyers, that had been on the assumption that they would obediently take their legal skill and an admiration for English common law back home again. Now that the new generation was here to stay, the welcome was being withdrawn. A few months later, in early 1969, I set up a society of Afro-Asian and Caribbean lawyers with a recently qualified Guyanese barrister who was becoming a good friend, Rudy Narayan, and a fellow student and former political prisoner from Rhodesia called Byron Hove. It was starting to seem that even in this country, securing equal rights would require a serious effort. Our group was tiny, though many, perhaps most, the students supported in principle. There was widespread fear among them that speaking out could damage their career prospects. But a new regulation then caused attitudes to harden. It made it impossible to practice in England unless you first declared an intention to do so. As the authorities knew full well, the change had a very disproportionate impact on Commonwealth students. An intention to work was incompatible with the conditions attached to a student visa. Anyone who wanted to retain the option of practice in the UK therefore exposed himself to the risk of deportation. The Inns insisted that the reform was colourblind, but anger quickly mounted. We complained to the recently created Race Relations Board, and on the eve of my call to the bar in November 1969, in my last act as president of the Inner Temple Students Association, I led another sit-in. Once again, our demands were not met, but a new generation of activists emerged. My elected successor was Jack Dromey, who is now a member of the Shadow Cabinet. Another person who became activist at this time was someone else you may have heard of, an outspoken woman from Glasgow called Helena Kennedy. Though the Inner Temple backed down from threats to disallow my call, my theoretical advancement into the profession simply meant a whole new set of obstacles. There were still no more than 10 practicing non-white barristers. Most worked from an address in Lincoln's Inn that was often nicknamed, quite shamefully in my opinion, the Ghetto Chambers. As far as I recall, only one established place had any black or Asian tenants at all, Sir Dinglefoot's set at Two Paper Building. Just as the inns had been making it harder for non-white immigrants to qualify, it now turned out that chambers were systematically withholding pupilages. For more than a year, I myself had no luck at all. Once, after appearing as an Urdu interpreter at the Old Bailey, the prosecutor invited me to be his pupil. But just before I was supposed to start, his clerk telephoned to withdraw the offer. It was so frustrating that I protested in person to the Inner Temple. But then, in late 1970, the limbo seemed finally to end. Tony Gifford, who had been very sympathetic when I had been mobilizing students at the Council for Legal Education, took me on as a pupil at John Platt Mill's set at Cloisters. But though I brought in lots of work, and though I was in the Old Bailey on the first day of my second six, conducting a trial that I won, I was then passed over for tenancy. Such things sometimes just happen, and Cloister was known for its support of radical causes. But I'm afraid that even now, after all these years, I still have serious doubts about the collective decision. As I was later told, a few tenants were worried that my reputation for complaining about racism might cause important solicitors to send briefs elsewhere. That reflected something I would come across repeatedly throughout my career. Solicitors often refuse to brief non-white barristers on the basis that clients, judges, or juries preferred white ones. The majority of barristers, including many who were personally embarrassed by racism, turned a blind eye. And when we took countermeasures by sidestepping the old boys network and directing clients to friendly solicitors, there was the constant risk of disciplinary action on the basis that we were touting for work. Anyway, by the beginning of 1973, I had been squatting for more than a year, and since no one would give me a tenancy, I contemplated setting up a chamber of my own. Today, it's hard to convey just how extraordinary that idea was. Almost everyone I discussed it with thought I was joking. In those days, chambers were not created, they just existed. There were none outside the Inns of Court. Apart from the recently established black set in Lincoln's Inn that was insultingly called a ghetto chamber, the traditional arrangement had never been challenged. The practical reasons are obvious. In an ideal world, juniors should have established library facilities, good clerks, as well as close links to experienced senior tenants. I had none of these, but also I had no choice. I contacted the Inner Temple, though I had my disagreement with the authorities several times over the years. The inn took my plan seriously, enough to offer me the third floor at 11 King's Bench Walk. When I got the keys in March 73, there were just 5 other tenants. 3 white men, a white woman, and a black man. We were all under 35, and we had to get our practices off the ground from scratch. Our set quickly expanded though, and I think it's fair to say that we were soon the first truly multiracial chambers in England. I personally had to learn very fast. Becoming the head of chambers immediately after pupillage posed many challenges, and fields of law like immigration and judicial review were changing rapidly. Most of my work was in crime. I had been picking up practical experience since my year without pupillage, when I offered my services as a legal advisor to an organization called the Pakistani Workers' Union. In response to so-called Paki bashing by skinheads and the fatal stabbing of a man called Tosir Ali in East London, I had made a speech in May 1970 reminding the community that it was legal to use reasonable force in self-defense. That hadn't ended the dangers, of course, but it had raised my profile further, and it meant that even more work came in. Over the next few years, it became clear that immigrants didn't just face racism on the streets. They could become its victim in courtrooms as well. Racism riddled the legal profession from top to bottom. I could give dozens of examples, but I'll mention just one to illustrate how bad the situation was. It involves an Old Bailey judge called Neil McKinnon. In January 1978, he presided over the trial of a National Front activist who was charged with inciting racial hatred. He had made a speech in which he said about the recent murder of an Asian, 1 down, a million to go, and in which he had used the words niggers, wogs, and coons. McKinnon made his sympathies crystal clear. He said it had taken guts to speak out. When the jury then returned an acquittal, he discharged the defendant with the remarks, "I wish you well." More than 20 non-white barristers expressed anger at the judge's comments, and I told journalists that we would boycott his courtroom. The Bar Council then invited me with Rudy Narayan to attend for discussion. But it turned out that it wasn't actually concerned by McKinnon's behavior. It was our behavior thought unacceptable. In the event of practical problems, we were told, Chambers class could telephone the Old Bailey to make sure we were allocated a different court. In other words, for the Bar Council it was more important to maintain appearance than to acknowledge overt racism in the judiciary. We refused to back down, and though there was no formal censure of the judge at all, the Lord Chancellor eventually let it be known that McKinnon would prefer not to hear comparable cases again. As I've already suggested, the problems were particularly intense when solicitors were involved, because personal and professional concerns were then mixed up with clients' interests. It was difficult for all of us. In September 78, Rudy Narayan complained that he had had letters from prisoners who had told him their solicitor wouldn't brief him, and he declared war on racism, only to be charged more than a year later with professional misconduct. I defended him on the basis that there was nothing wrong with waging a war on racism. He was cleared, but it wasn't the first time such a problem had arisen. and it certainly wouldn't be the last. As non-white lawyers multiplied, there were more conflicts. The pressure for reform also increased. We went down many conventional routes. In the summer of 1980, for example, we urged the recently established Commission for Racial Equality to investigate problems within the legal profession. But the CRE dragged its feet, and in late 1981, we decided to take a more radical approach. Lawyers from visible ethnic minorities were becoming more confident about confronting discrimination because there was strength in numbers and their common legal interests were increasingly obvious. So Rudy and I relaunched the Society of Afro-Asian and Caribbean Lawyers as the Society of Black Lawyers. I was first chairman and Rudy general secretary. Describing all its activities would be difficult, simply because there were too many. Margaret Thatcher had made fears of immigration respectable by warning that UK was in danger of being swamped. Upheavals were sweeping through non-white communities. Recent riots in Bristol and Brixton would soon be followed by a summer of trouble across the Midlands and northern England. Because time is limited, I'll just focus on just one incident arising out of the trials that followed. The example I have in mind involved the effort that defense barristers made to secure representative juries. In the early 80s, it was perfectly proper to object to prospective jurors before a trial. This procedure, known as the right of preemptive challenge, was centuries old. In racially sensitive cases, it would have been negligent not to recognize that a diverse jury was usually in the defendant's interest. But after the trial of alleged rioters in Bristol, where I formed part of a defense team that used the strategy successfully, we were condemned by no less a figure than Lord Denning, who was then Master of the Rolls. In a 1982 book, he complained that we had, in his words, packed the jury with colored jurors, who, in his view, often came from countries where bribery and graft are accepted as an integral part of life, and where stealing is a virtue, so long as you are not found out. According to Denning, they will never accept the word of a policeman against one of their own. The Society of Black Lawyers publicly demanded his resignation and supported a number of jurors who were threatening legal action, whereupon the book was withdrawn from sale and Denning announced his retirement from the bench. I don't want to sound vindictive. It barely needs saying that Lord Denning had immense achievements to his name. It also does him great credit that he acknowledged in a later book that he shouldn't have said what he did say. I think, however, that there is a need to record the scale of the obstacle we faced. And in the same way, it's important to recognize that there were progressive forces in play as well. That same spring, in 1982, the Runnymede Trust invited me to address a conference at Sussex University at which speakers from the United States, including leading black lawyers, described the problems they faced in their country. The very next day, I was contacted by Mr. Justice Brown Wilkinson, as he then was, who offered his help. The outcome was the establishment of an official working party that comprised 7 members of the Society of Black Lawyers and 7 white barristers, including the chairman of the bar. With the working party's report in August 1984, the bar formally acknowledged for the first time that racism was real and that demanded a response. That led to important reforms. The working party became a permanent race relations committee, and the code of conduct was amended to prohibit racial discrimination in offers of people. I dissented from the majority in one important way. I wanted the bar to go further by proposing an amendment to the Race Relations Act to outlaw discriminatory briefing practices by solicitors. Resistance from the Law Society meant that my recommendation was rejected. And just a year later, in 1985, a prisoner wrote to me several times begging for help because his solicitor was refusing to instruct me. When I telephoned to ask why, the solicitor suggested I was touting for work and made an official complaint against me. The Bar Council told me a prima facie case had been made out. I told it to get lost. But it wasn't until 1990 that the law changed. Only then did it become illegal for a solicitor to brief a barrister on the basis of his skin color. As that recollection suggests, even the tiniest conflict could be exhausting. And I want to conclude with a very personal observation. When I began my career, non-white bar students faced discrimination, and immigrants everywhere faced systematic injustices. In response, many of us sometimes became too angry for our own good, and I myself certainly made some mistakes along the way. But we would have got nowhere by deferring to tradition and respecting legal etiquette. Whereas society at large started to confront racism with the first Race Relations Act of 1965, the Bar Council maintained until the early 80s that it was somehow above it all. The Law Society's response was even more pernicious. Instead of denying the significance of racism in the legal profession, it blamed everyone but its own members. Insofar as clients insisted on white counsel, it said solicitors would follow their wishes. Insofar as clients wanted a specific barrister who was Asian or black, it supported anyone who claimed this wasn't in their objective interest. Racism was entrenched, and yet our effort to say so exposed us again and again to criticism and in some cases to disciplinary action. Today, almost 40 years later, the situation is vastly improved. Non-white lawyers rarely face the dilemma that was once so common, whether to speak out or stay silent in the face of discrimination. And the open injustice that used to be normal is now history. These days, members of ethnic minorities serve at every level of the judiciary, except the Supreme Court. Most simply, but also most importantly, a generation of lawyers has grown to maturity, knowing racism to be wrong. There is still plenty to be done. Only recently, it was in the news that a black barrister was mistaken for a defendant. But it's impossible to believe that things will ever be as bad again. That's what I think anyway. But perhaps I'm wrong. To find out, I'm now going to hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much for listening to me. At the end of this morning session, I'll of course be happy to take any question you might have.
So thank you very much, Master Kadri, for taking us through your career and highlighting your struggle for diversity and the struggle for diversity. As you said, there is a real need to record and highlight this journey, which really this roundtable is trying to address. And I was struck very much with the startling mirroring of your experience with that of the first women barristers, which we're going to talk about in the second session. And really, as you said, diversity isn't an empty word. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker, Professor Leslie Thomas, QC, who is that next generation of BAME lawyer who has grown to maturity. So Professor Thomas is a human rights, civil liberties barrister. He's appeared in many leading high-profile death in custody cases representing families of the deceased. For example, Azelle Rodney, Mark Duggan, Christopher Alder, and Sean Rigg. In 2012, he was awarded the Legal Aid Barrister of the Year, and again in 2016 for his work on the Hillsborough disaster. In 2020, he received the award for outstanding contribution to diversity and inclusivity in the UK Chambers Bar Awards. A former joint head of Garden Court Chambers, in 2020, he became the first Black professor of law at Gresham College, an enormous achievement that I think really needs to be celebrated. And it was certainly celebrated in my law school. He is a visiting professor of law at Goldsmiths, the University of London. He is currently one of the senior barristers representing many survivors and families following the Grenfell fire disaster. Master Thomas is a bencher of Bina Temple and an advocacy trainer. He also sits on the Equality and Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee for the IM. So thank you, Leslie Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for that warm welcome. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
Firstly, I want to pay tribute to Master Kadri. It's lawyers like him that paved the way for lawyers like me to make that journey. And I hope I am paving the way for the next generation of lawyers, just to make that journey a bit easier. I want to talk about not just my journey, but also my experiences and life at the bar. Let me start by saying this. 2 years ago, I was in the High Court, seeking an emergency injunction on the judicial review to stop the construction of an international airport on environmental grounds. Various planning regulations had been breached. This was a high-profile case. As I walked into Court 2 in the High Court, I had an experience that I'd never experienced before in my life. The High Court judge was a Black woman. My junior was a Black woman. Government counsel was a Black woman. The counsel for the planning authority was a Black woman. And so too was counsel for the airport. In fact, I was the only man in court. After that case, I have to say to all my fellow counsel that it was one of the most positive experiences I'd ever had. This case was in the Antiguan High Court. That was the norm. My parents are from the Caribbean, 2 small islands, Antigua and Dominica. Dad's father was a farmer who grew a variety of vegetables in the mineral-rich, volcanic, mountainous soils of the northeastern part of Dominica. Mum's father was a fisherman who used to go out at night and bring back to his family of 10 lobsters, mahi-mahi, snapper, and all sorts of wonders from the sea. Neither of my parents' families had much by way of material possessions, but they had close-knit communities, support and love. Both my parents came to the motherland, Great Britain, as it was then called. Dad in the late 50s, Mum in the early 60s, as part of the Windrush generation. Like so many immigrants to Europe and the United Kingdom, poverty is a driver which makes people leave their homes in search of a better life. Both were invited to the UK as part of the Great British Clean-up to help rebuild post-war Britain, which had lost a generation of young men in the previous war. Britain was not particularly warm, colourful, or inviting. I am told it was particularly cold, dark, and grey. My parents met each other in West London. They fell in love, had my sister, and then me. We were poor, incredibly poor. Life in the UK in the 60s was tough. It was particularly tough if you were Black. There was no proper and effective anti-discrimination laws back then. People would discriminate against you at their leisure. Remember, this was a time when landlords could put up advertisements in their windows saying things like, no Irish, no Blacks, no dogs. Black and white minstrels was popular on television. Sitcoms such as Love Thy Neighbour and Alf Garnett were staple Saturday night TV viewing. In 1965, I was born in a small bedsit flat on the Latimer Road. Our landlord was a gentleman by the name of Mr. Peter Rackman. Now, Mr. Rackman was a notorious slum landlord who didn't care about the colour of your skin. He cared more about the colour of your money. He made a business out of the exploitation of immigrant tenants. In the 60s, finding accommodation if you were a person of colour was extremely difficult. The rental market, as I've explained, was limited for Black people. Our first home, my mum tells me, was extremely cold and drafty and in a poor state of repair. The 4 of us, Mum, Dad, my elder sister of 3 years, and me, baby Leslie, had to sit in a bed sitting room around the paraffin heater for heat. Mum would also prepare meals on the same heater for the 4 of us. We shared a bathroom with 3 other families, a Jamaican family, a Nigerian family, and an Irish family. It was a cosmopolitan community growing up in the Notting Hill area, I was too young to remember, but my mum tells me about those early days with fondness. When my younger brother came along 2 years after me, we were now a family of 5, and mum decided she could no longer continue living in private rented accommodation. And so my parents decided to get us into social housing, a wonderful housing association which helped Irish families and West Indian families decided to offer us accommodation in a beautiful Victorian terrace house in Battersea, in an area known as Betwixt the Commons. Yes, I spent my formative years literally having adventures on Clapham and Wandsworth Common. Life was good. Battersea in those days was extremely multicultural. It was a time when Clapham Junction still had a proper Caribbean market. Many of our neighbours were working class. The life and character of Battersea was destined to change forever a few years later by the late 80s and early 90s. I went to a comprehensive school in Battersea, had some scholarly talents and decided that perhaps law was for me. This was not an easy decision. Mum was a nurse who worked nights. Dad was a telephone technician who worked for British Telecom. It was in 1980 that I had my first experience with the police. This would be an experience that would shape my young life and destiny, and as it happens, later shape the lives and destiny for many police officers who find themselves coming up against me. Yes, I was touched. I was stopped, I was searched, walking home from school one afternoon, stopped for no good reason. It was because I was told I looked suspicious. When I asked why, I was given another reason, that I fitted the description of someone who'd committed a burglary. I asked how I fitted the description. I was told, don't be cheeky, son. I can only assume that the burglar was wearing a school uniform, looked about 13 or 14 and was black. I decided then that I would want to make a difference. I wanted to become a lawyer. Not any lawyer, but one of those lawyers who represented people in court. Now, in the early 80s, I knew nothing about the law or how to become a lawyer. I was clueless. I went to a careers advisor at school for help and advice. The advice I got was, I was told I needed to go to Oxbridge, that my sights were set too high. I was being unrealistic. That why didn't I think about using my hands? Perhaps become a mechanic or get a nice reliable job in the local Sainsbury's. In other words, I was told, know your place. The thing is, this advice just made me even more determined to achieve the goal which I'd set for myself and which was now a burning desire within me. I went to law school at Kingston Polytechnic as it was then known. This was in 1984. In my year of about 100 people, there were only 6 people of colour. I was the only black man. Welcome to the world of law. The vast majority of my year were gearing up to become solicitors, most of them commercial solicitors. This was not for me. I wanted to do advocacy, the exciting work, dealing with real people who had real problems. I was never interested in making a ton of money for a commercial enterprise. By my 3rd year, I'd shown real promise. As a legal scholar, my law professor decided to introduce me to a good friend of his, a commercial barrister, who decided to take me on as his pupil. I was given my first big break. I was told I had to join the Inner Temple because that was the best inn. So I did in 1987. I completed bar school. I had landed on my feet. In 1988, life at the bar was not particularly welcoming for people of colour. I remember the first time I came to the inn. It was the first of my then 24 dinners. We were told back then you had to eat dinners to become a barrister. I came into this big dining hall, looked around, saw the coats of arms and real armour, wood panel walls. I thought I was in a museum. It was one of those occasions when we had to wear a gown for our dinner. There were hardly any other black faces in the dining hall. Grace was said before the meal. It wasn't the grace that I was used to, where my mother and father would thank the Lord, and thank everything, and thank everyone before we set out to eat our meal. This was in Latin. Yes, Latin. I felt to myself, what planet am I on? The master who sat on my table was seated next to me. He said to me, when our conversation started, "Do you like cricket?" I replied, "I didn't. I preferred football." The second question he asked me was which island I was from. I replied in jest that the only islands they had where I was from were traffic islands in West London. This was met with much hilarity from the rest of the table. The master was not amused. He did not ask me a third question. Pupillage was mixed. My first supervisor, the friend of my law professor who gave me a break, was a wonderful man. He gave me a fantastic pupillage. I was the first black pupil in this chambers. Quite frankly, at times, with the other members of chambers, they often found it difficult to make conversation with me. Not because I'm not chatty or curious, but apart from law, our life experiences were so different. We came from entirely different worlds. My world was very working class, very diverse, and black. Their worlds was the worlds of private clubs, private schools, big posh universities with big posh alumni societies, very expensive homes, classical music, opera, and things I was generally ignorant of. Jokes would often be made at my expense by some members of chambers, and in particular one man who'd later become my second supervisor. He thought it was funny to try to imitate the comedian Jim Davison with a faux Jamaican accent whenever he spoke to me. Remember, this was at a time when British television had a diet of incredibly racist material, which was being fed to the general public. It was thought to be acceptable to mock me about the colour of my skin. When I challenged him, and believe you, I often did, I was told, "Leslie, don't have a chip on your shoulder." That it was all done in humour, and I needed to have a sense of humour. I was often othered, made to feel small and insignificant. The clerks at that chamber said to me, after I had been waiting for about a month for my first case, that they had the perfect case for me. Yes, my first brief. It was a family case. Remember, this was a chamber that hardly did any family work, but I did not care. This was real work with a real client. I was representing a father in custody and a domestic injunction dispute with his wife. I turned up at court. My client was black. I was surprised in the sense that in the previous 6 months in this set of chambers, I had never set eyes on another black soul, let alone a black client. Indeed, I was only the only black person I'd ever seen in these chambers amongst the client, staff, or tenants, but I was grateful. Unfortunately, my first experience in court was hostile. The usher, when I went to speak to her, was harsh with me and told me to wait my turn. I now realise she thought I was probably the client. Not that that would have been any way to have spoken to a client or court user. The experience did not improve when I went into court. I remember addressing the judge on the case, and I explained that the dad really wanted to see his children. The judge exploded at me like a volcano. He went red in the face, screamed at the top of his voice, "Dad, Dad, you do not say dad in this court." I, for the life of me, did not know what crime I'd committed. It was only when I went back to chambers, I was told by my supervisor that dad was slang and I should have used the word father. I wasn't sure if I would make it at the bar, whether the bar was the right place for me. It was cold, it was unfriendly, it was hostile. I decided that I would spend most of my evenings volunteering at law centres. I did. 4 different evenings at 4 different law centres across the capital, which included the National Council for Civil Liberties, or Liberty as it's now known. It was at one of these sessions that I met the fantastic and the great Tony Gifford. And it's interesting to have heard Master Cardry say that Tony gave him his first break. Tony was the head of Wellington Street Chambers by this stage. I told him about my experience and he invited me to come to his chambers, which I did. They took me on. My life at the bar changed. These lawyers, these lefties, were meant to be pariahs, radical lawyers doing extreme work. In the late 80s and early 90s, representing people accused of Irish terrorism, the Guildford Four, the Birmingham Six, was still not popular work. I was introduced to the world of civil actions, inquests, landlord and tenant, social housing. I traveled the country and I met other Black barristers. We were often isolated and small in numbers. We were the minority, but we had a shared experience of being in the minority. We could relate to the experience we all faced. For example, judges being hostile for no apparent reason other than that we could fathom, other than for the colour of our skin. And before this is questioned, I'm not talking about, general judicial grumpiness. I'm talking about the noticeable difference people of colour would have in front of certain judges that white counterparts did not experience. Oftentimes, this was something you could never quite put your finger on, but you felt it, you knew something wasn't right. You see, some judges are just too clever to expose the discriminatory treatment that they would dish out towards barristers of colour. But there were other times when a judge just would let their guard down and make an inappropriate remark. Like the time that a judge told a colleague of mine at Garden Court, who happened to be Nigerian, in open court, that all Nigerians are fraudsters and cheats because those were the only people he saw in his court. My colleague was so upset. But this was a time when you had to think long and hard before you made a complaint, because the system was designed in such a way that who would you complain to? You would become labelled as a troublemaker, somebody who just was there to cause trouble. Or there was a time when I was actually told by a very famous coroner, one of the London coroners. He said this to me: "Mr. Thomas, in this country, we do not do things like that in this court," because he objected to a line of my questioning. A put down that was so obviously racist that it needs no further explanation. For those of you who believe that my experiences are very much in the past, think again. Now, they're much more subtle or hidden, or shared with a few, but not openly. I remember doing a big case and a solicitor came up to me, very upset, and informed me that she'd walked into court to collect her bag, which she had forgotten during the lunchtime adjournment, and overheard an opponent of mine. She caught him openly mocking me and making monkey noises to his client, as if when he was imitating a submission I had made just moments before. Yes, as shocking as that seems, these are all true examples, and this only occurred 4 or 5 years ago. But even life at the so-called progressive bar needs to be worked on. Whilst there are more lawyers and barristers of colour, there's still not enough of us doing work. All too often, we are thought to be criminal barristers or legal aid barristers. We are pigeonholed. Moreover, despite the fact, and I think I can say this now, that I am one of the country's leading inquest and inquiry lawyers, I'm often still not counsel of choice for many big leading inquiries. Perhaps this is because I'm outspoken and black, which is not conducive. Perhaps I'm not seen as a safe pair of hands, whereas the same is not the same for many of my white counterparts. But whilst I recount these negative experiences, I think it's important to note that the bar is changing, life is changing. The behaviours, the bullying, racism described is no longer tolerated. 30 years ago, I would never have dreamed that this inn would be putting on an event such as this. The Inner Temple has been a leader on these issues. Indeed, all the other inns are doing wonderful work on issues of diversity and inclusion, but I'm particularly proud of my inn. This year was my 30th year at Garden Court Chambers, one of the largest sets in the country, the largest in London and the second largest in the country. We have much diversity, but even there, we cannot rest on our laurels. I served as head of chambers there for 3 years. Nor should the Inner Temple rest on its laurels. Yes, the inn has been doing some incredible work on diversity, inclusion, and equality, and it's noticeable and it's impressive, but none of us can become complacent. 2020 has been a year where finally, I hope, people are taking Black lives seriously. Black lives do matter. It's a pity that it took the death of a Black man in the most horrendous circumstances to spur others into taking global action. But let me end where I start. I hope in my lifetime, I will be able to walk into court and no one will blink an eyelid if we have Black judges, Black women counsel, all doing big and important cases. It will become just the norm and not worthy of comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very, very inspiring talk. There are questions coming in for you. So perhaps we could just quickly get, I know you need to rush off. The first question is from an anonymous attendee. He says, I'm an aspiring barrister in my final year of my LLB. I've experienced several disciplinary actions during my schooling years for being outspoken against injustices, and I fear the same is likely to happen to me when I join the bar, which could cost me my career. What advice would you give when dealing with discrimination and racism at the bar?
When you're young, and when I say young, I mean young at the bar, it's absolutely crucial to get support from colleagues, more senior colleagues, you know, outspoken individuals like myself, people who can command respect, get their support behind you. I'll give you an example. I had a junior member of the bar contact me, somebody I didn't know actually, but they just contacted me and told me about an experience that they had in court where a judge had been discriminatory, racist towards them. And I gave them support and I put them in contact with people and gave them the encouragement to make a complaint, which they did. And that is what you need to do. I think it's too much to ask of youngsters to do this on their own because you don't want to be sidelined. And you're right, you do need to be concerned about your career, but there is safety in numbers. And so the advice is seek support, seek allies. And there are a number of us who would be prepared to support and advise you and assist you in situations like that.
Thank you. And then we have another question. What do you think those of us coming up behind you can actually do to increase progress, both those of us who are Black lawyers and our non-Black colleagues?
I think it's really important to participate, get on to committees, participate in the inn. You know, the more of us that there are participating, it normalizes us. It makes it you know, when I first started, a number of us would not participate in life at the bar because it was so cold, hostile. But I have done that over the last few years, and I think it's really important because you get to mix with, you know, the traditional bar, you get to mix with the judiciary. And I think the more that the judiciary see us, not just in one context in court, but socialize, we become normal. And I think that's really important to do. So we need to participate in all aspects of life at the bar.
And then there's another question that actually I wanted to ask you, because you talked about this sort of casual racism, you know, that people would make jokes, and that, you know, so it would be discrimination, racism, prejudice, but they would dress it up as a joke. And I wanted to ask you how we should deal with that casual racism, because in fact I come across it quite often, but there is a question on the chat about that as well, that says, how best can we address the subtle discrimination collectively? And it's that casual racism, casual sexism.
These are all microaggressions, where it's turned on you as the recipient. You know, there's something wrong with you for not accepting this. Or what needs to happen? There needs to be zero tolerance on all of these microaggressions, these things, these jokes. They're not jokes. They other you, they make you feel small, they humiliate you. They're just not to be tolerated. And so I think that all organizations should have a code of conduct, and none of these microaggressions should be tolerated. You know, and I think they need to be called out. It's really important that white colleagues don't become, you know, in on these jokes and laugh them off. I think if a white colleague hears another white colleague making a joke like this, it needs to be, you know, that's not funny, that's not to be tolerated, you know. And the more we do that, the more we will drive away those types of microaggressions, and they will be unacceptable behaviour at the bar.
And then I also wanted to ask you that you spoke about how when you were doing your LLB, you met somebody who, your lecturer introduced you to the person who would give you a pupillage. If that hadn't have happened, how do you think your career would? I mean, obviously you don't have a crystal ball, but it's just that networks and connections are so essential in law. Well, they're in any career.
You know, it was so anti-equal opportunities the way I got my pupillage. You know, it was a nod and a wink, but it worked for me. It gave me that big break. Who knows? Maybe I would have got there via another route. I don't have a crystal ball, but I like to think, but for that, I wouldn't be at the bar. You know, my lecturer, and I'll give him a shout out, Robert Upex, he was just amazing. And Professor Upex just saw promise in me and got me that first big break. And I'm forever grateful for it, even though at times in that first set of chambers, the experiences were not all fantastic. As I say, the experiences were mixed. My first supervisor was an amazing man, brilliant, kind-hearted man who, you know, never othered me, never made me feel small. But you know, it wasn't an experience I had across the board at that set.
And then another question for Rona, which is, do you agree that sadly our own worst enemies can be our colleagues?
Yeah, but that's life.
And then there's a question from Isabel that says, does it need to be appreciated that suggestions of incompetence can be microaggression?
Yes.
And then the final.
Can I expand? I think it's really important, and I've written a couple of articles in Council magazine, and if you haven't read them, I would encourage you to have. You know, Council magazine has been writing, you know, doing a really interesting series on race, so throughout this year. But the editions I would invite you to have a look at is the July edition, where I say let's talk about race, and then the November edition where I do part 2, how are we doing as a profession, and I look at the whole issue about microaggressions. And I would also ask people to look at the December edition of Council magazine, which has got 3 really excellent articles from race. But on the issue of microaggressions, I think it's really important that we educate ourselves. Everybody needs to educate themselves. And I think it's important for, I think it's important for chambers, the inns, to educate themselves in anti-racist behaviour. And it's not good enough or an excuse to say, well, we don't have many black tenants, we don't have many tenants of colour in our sets, therefore we're not going to do anything about it. Everybody needs to do this, because you might be meeting clients, you might be meeting other people in court, you know, and this is just, as a profession, it's behaviour we should not be tolerating.
So 3 more questions, and then I know that you need to get off. So the first of the 3 is, when black clients who are very vulnerable on legal aid request black barristers, why is there a reluctance to take cases, which I've experienced? We understand availability and funding issues, but it's concerning when we reach out, we are rejected, sometimes in cases where there are merits.
So let me see if I've understood the question. So a black client reaches out and requests black counsel,
yeah,
and there's a reluctance by the counsel to take on the case. I have to say, I don't know. There may well be many reasons for that. Can I talk about my experience?
Yes, please.
In that sort. I get written to all the time because of my profile by lots of black potential clients who reach out to me. I'm very easy to get hold of because I've got quite a high Twitter profile and on other social media. And I'll have clients with, you know, the most horrendous, heartbreaking cases who write to me asking me to represent them or help them. Oftentimes, it's cases I don't have experience in. So it's not because I don't want to help them. It's either because you know, I don't have experience in that area of law, and I don't want to. But what I will do, and what I often do, is I often point them in the direction of somebody who may be able to help them. Or if it's an area of law that I do, I'm often, you know, if you look at my diary is just horrendous. I've just got back to back, you know, I'm fully booked now until the end of next year because of, you know, the big inquiries that I'm in. And it's very difficult, you know, clients who contact you find it very hard to understand that you could have a diary that's fully booked for a year, and it's not because you don't want to take their cases on. It's just that's just how it is. So I don't know why other barristers might not take a case on, but oftentimes you'll find that there are good reasons. You know, I find generally that barristers do want to help, particularly when people reach out to them.
And then the second question is, how can allies best perform our role in challenging and confronting racism? I think we've touched on this already, but maybe you have something else to add. The question goes on both when it's directed in person at someone who is themselves present and when it is about someone who isn't present. So how can allies best perform our role in challenging and confronting racism?
Calling it out. Sometimes I appreciate sometimes the way in which you call something out is difficult. I do believe there are occasions when you need to call something out immediately, so that it doesn't look like you're becoming complicit in the behaviour. I just think that's really, but there are other times when you need to use your discretion. You might want to pull somebody aside. It might be a senior judge, you might want to write a note, but you want to be able to let whoever it is know that the behaviour is unacceptable. And I really do believe training is really important, and education. There's no excuse. absolutely no excuse in 2020 for any of us not to be educated in what is a vitally important area. There's so many excellent books on anti-racism and anti-discrimination. I know that the Inner Temple has collated a list, and I don't know if somebody in the Inner Temple can put in the chat a list of the books. I've seen the Inner Temple got a very good book list on anti-discrimination material which people could read. So I think that's what I would say.
Brilliant. And then the last question, I'm not sure whether it's really within your expertise, but it says, it thanks you, which I think we all thank you very much for a fantastic talk. So it's from Natalie. She says, I'm so grateful for this. Thank you, Professor Thomas. I would like to ask if you have a view on the outreach by the INS for scholarships. I believe strongly that news about the scholarships are sent out to Russell Group universities in Oxbridge and Cantab, and I didn't find out about these until very late. The weight given to these scholarships doesn't take into account the fact that only the top university students really are able to access them as a resource.
This is very important. I think what's been said needs to get back to the outreach committee. I know the outreach committee are, doing their best to go to non-Russell Group universities. I think it's an area where a lot more work needs to be done. I would quite like the information to get before university. I think it needs to get to students in the sixth form of schools to know that because when you're deciding on a career, knowing about funding is an important decision. And, I know that many sixth formers might otherwise not try for life at the bar because of funding. And if that information is given in state schools early, that might change the career pathway of many youngsters. So the IN is listening to this, and I think there's more work to be done.
Lovely. Well, I think we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much. There was a final question, which was about anti-racist pedagogy. Should it be taught in law school? And I think we both agree that, of course, it needs to be done. Certainly, our degree is being revalidated at the moment. That it's going to be taught the whole way through. There's going to be a specific module on it. I think most universities are beginning to decolonise their courses. So I will let you go. But
can I give a plug?
Please.
Tomorrow evening, Gresham, my second lecture. Who investigates sudden death? It's going to be good.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll find the link to that and I'll put it in the chat while the next speaker's on. But thank you so much for giving us your time, for being so inspiring and for giving us lots of practical tips. So thank you very much. You take care.
Sorry for overrunning.
Not at all. Thank you. Thanks. Right then. So we have our third speaker of today, who I will very briefly introduce to you. That's Master Badejo, who is going to, she's a barrister at Thornbrick Court, and she will present a picture of her work in chambers as a Black woman working at the bar, and she'll be tracking her own career. So in 2012, she was nominated and shortlisted for the Young Legal Aid Barrister of the Year at the Legal Aid Lawyers Awards for her work with Greenwich Housing Rights. She is also a trustee of Greenwich Housing Rights. After completing her BBC, she worked as a solicitor's agent, undertaking advocacy work in possession actions, housing, consumer credit, bankruptcy, and landlord and tenant. Prior to joining Chambers, she also volunteered as a Mackenzie friend for a domestic violence charity and a duty advisor for a housing charity in Greenwich. So I will hand us over now to Master Badejo, who's going to now talk about her career. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak about my experiences. And I'm going to start off first with my experience in chambers. Starting at Fallbrook Court, I did my pupillage there. And I'm still there, and it's a chambers that's very close to my heart. I've been really lucky in that we have a very collegiate and warm atmosphere. So I always felt very supported from the get-go. I also remember feeling that I was able to say what I wanted to a certain degree, or to basically stand my ground. I remember when I was going into my second six, we had the big chat with the senior clerk. He said, you know, you're going into your second six, it's going to be really busy, you're entitled to holiday, you might not want to take it because, of course, you're going to be really busy. And my response was to kind of chuckle and remind him that I was going to New York in a few months' time for my 30th birthday, and there were no repercussions from that at all. But that's not to say it has been completely plain sailing, and there've been minor things that have happened, which I do wonder if they would have happened if I had been a white male, for example. So my clerks for some time would call me BB, which I don't mind. I don't mind being referred to by my first name by anybody. But then I noticed that with junior members, male junior members who are more junior to me, they'd call them Mr. X and Mr. Y. And I wasn't the only woman that experienced that. And thankfully, that's been dealt with and it doesn't happen anymore. But it was something that I noticed. Another thing that I noticed was when we went out as a social with the juniors, as we are quite close. Well, we're not juniors anymore, but when we were juniors, we were quite close. And looking around and noticing that not only was I the only Black person, I was also the only non-blonde. And that sent a huge message to me, because it made me feel as if I was flying the flag for my entire race. It wasn't that I felt like I fit in completely. And it was slightly problematic. And I'm glad to say that my former head of chambers really spearheaded diversifying chambers, and it looks a lot more different now. And we're also looking into schemes which enable people who aren't as represented within chambers to do mini pupillages and so on. So that definitely has changed, but it was something that I had experienced and I raised an eyebrow at. But overall, as a pupil and as a junior tenant, I've been really fortunate actually within my chambers, and it's been great from that point of view. If we move on to my experience in court, I would have to say that, like many Black barristers, I have gone to court and been mistaken or even corrected as being anyone other than counsel. So I might go in and sign my name in and say, oh, by the way, I'm counsel for the local authority. I do family law. I do a lot of care work. And on more than one occasion over the years, I have been corrected and said, oh, do you mean social worker? No, I don't mean social worker. I mean counsel. And it does, again, make me wonder if that would happen to someone who didn't look like me, or who was a male, or perhaps who was white, because I don't hear those experiences from them, but I certainly do from my Black counterparts. And I'm not going to say it doesn't happen to any other ethnic minorities or Asian people, for example, but I don't know of those cases. And there was the recent matter of Alexandra Wilson, who's a criminal barrister who went to court and on 3 times was mistaken as the defendant by a number of people. And there was an immediate reaction from the Bar Council, which was great, and also from HMCTS. And I know that a lot of barristers and solicitors expressed horror at that this was going on and it was happening so regularly. But one thing that has come up for me within that is that I've experienced this from counsel and solicitors as well. It isn't just court staff. It's from my peers and my counterparts too. And it does remind me of one particular occasion where it was for a family case and I had gone to court. I was acting for the local authority. I hadn't met counsel for mother yet, so I didn't know who that was, whether or not it was a man or woman, what they looked like, or anything else. And I had found the counsel for the children and guardian. And she is an extremely experienced, very senior Black female barrister. And I'd gone in to introduce myself, and she said, "I've just met counsel for mother." And she came and she asked me if I was the guardian. And I said, "No, where did you get that from?" And she had pointed to the signing in sheet where it actually said the counsel's name under the section for counsel, but for some reason had decided she couldn't be counsel, she must be the guardian. And when she was corrected, she sheepishly went away. And that was, of course, really disappointing. But what compounded the situation was, as I finished that conversation with that lady and stepped out into the corridor, I was approached by a white male counsel from a completely different case, absolutely nothing to do with me, who asked if I was a list caller. No, I'm not. And it was just amazing within a period of 10 to 20 minutes that both of us had had such a similar experience as Alexandra Wilson. And as I've said before, it has happened time and time again. I do have to say that this, thankfully, isn't a common occurrence. I've been practicing for 10 years and it has happened, but thankfully it doesn't happen every day. But it's something that I do feel that needs to be addressed, not only with court staff, but also with barristers, solicitors, and also probably judges as well. So just turning back to my experience as a whole, in the first 7 years after pupillage, I felt that I was bumbling along and not really seeing how I could progress. The idea of applying for silk just seemed completely out of my reach, and applying to be a judge was even further still. And that's not to say that there weren't any other role models for me. There were a few deputy district judges, a couple of Black female recorders, and I remember being in front of a Black male deputy high court judge and just being in awe because it was something that I aspired to, but they all seemed so brilliant and I didn't see myself within that. And I took the plunge in 2017 to really just start focusing on my own development. And if anything was going to change, it was going to be me. And what I concentrated on was diversity and advocacy, because they're both passions of mine. So just turning to diversity first, I was very conscious of the diversity between the numbers of Black, Asian, and other ethnic minority students that were applying for pupillage, and then the relatively low number that were obtaining pupillage. And when you compared that to their English or other white counterparts, there was a huge disparity. So what I did was created a team of about 6 people, and I conducted a 6-month research project, which looked at what students and professionals thought could be put in place and what was wanted and needed in order to address this disparity. And I can't say that I have the answer to that. It was only a 6-month project, but what really came up for me was the idea that Black, Asian, and other ethnic minority practitioners weren't as visible to students, and what they wanted to see was more of us. And I hadn't twigged that really. I know that I'd gone to a number of sessions at the Inn where there were student events, and people would make a beeline for me and ask, "How is it? Is it racist? How do you find it? Do you get racism from solicitors? What about clients? How are you approached in court?" There were so many questions for me, and I got the impression from that, and also from the results of the survey that I had conducted, that a lot of ethnic minority students felt that if they weren't seeing people that looked like them, they were the ones that would have to break that ceiling. And that wasn't a burden that I certainly wanted them to have to take on board, because A, it isn't true. There is a lot of work that needs to be done, but it isn't true. And so having conversations with people in the Inn and the staff who have been brilliant, such as the outreach manager and the scholarships manager, have meant that there's been a lot more focus in terms of diversity, and I've been able to contribute to that. And part of my contributions have been things like volunteering on scholarship panels, because my presence makes a difference. So I'm not just saying my presence as Bibi Badejo makes a difference, but in terms of diversifying the panel and also bringing a different perspective, because things like, for instance, there being an applicant, a candidate who had worked all the way through university and got excellent grades, and that was dismissed. And I'd had to point out that she doesn't get a break. She doesn't get to go on a gap year. She doesn't get to go on holidays or relax. If she's not studying, she's working. If she's not working, she's studying. So what she has done, it shows an incredible amount of motivation and also skill. And that enabled my fellow panel members to reconsider the way that they were approaching this candidate. And again, it really did make a difference. And through the work that I have done with the bar, I've had really great opportunities to sit on committees on the end that actually make a difference, starting with the Bar Liaison Committee, the Temple Women's Forum as well. And at the moment, I sit on the Equality, Diversity and Inclusivity Subcommittee, the Advocacy Trainers Committee, the Scholarship Committee, and I'm currently on a working group on scholarships, in which we're in the process of finalising a report which makes recommendations so the whole scholarships process can be more inclusive for different groups, such as ethnicity, socioeconomic groups, gender, and so on. And I firmly believe that as I received a scholarship, and I know what a huge difference it made to me, I want to give back to the Inn and its members. So this is a way that I can contribute back to the Inn and make a difference. And I'm glad to say that as a result of the work that I have done at the Inn and working with staff at the Inn, I was elected as a governing bencher in July 2020. And this is something that I had never thought was available to me. I thought maybe in about 10 years' time, I might poke around and see if there was anything that I could do in order to apply to become a bencher. I had no idea about the process, but because of what I had done within that, someone, a really kind judge, approached me and suggested that I should apply, and I did, and I was elected as a bencher. And I hope that that is a example to other people that if Bibi can do it, I certainly can as well. The second area that I also decided to focus on in terms of my development was advocacy. And I've mentioned already that I felt that I was bumbling along. I didn't think that I was a particularly good advocate. I was competent, but I don't think that I was worrying anybody particularly in court. And truth be told, I really did find public speaking frightening at times. And I will tell you an embarrassing story. When I was a pupil on one of the advocacy training weekends, I remember giving a closing speech during one of the exercises, and I was so nervous that I stopped breathing. I was talking like this, it was really, really, really quick, and I couldn't get my breath in. And the next thing I knew, I was on my back, opening my eyes, with all these faces peering over me because I'd fainted, just completely embarrassing and out of utter fear. I'm happy to say it hasn't happened again, but those nerves didn't go away. So in 2017, I took the plunge to address this in the most proactive way that I could. And I got the courage to apply and attend for the Southeastern Circuit's Advanced Advocacy course, which is held annually at Keble. It's also known as the Keble course, and it's a week-long residential program in which you receive bespoke critique and you're able to build on good aspects of your advocacy and work on the weaker parts and develop that as well, so they become strengths as well. And I found it was a challenging, but my goodness, was it rewarding. The next contested hearing that I had, the judge quoted extensively from my cross-examination. He didn't make any findings against my client, and I was absolutely thrilled because that had never happened before. And this whole experience ignited a passion about advocacy that hasn't died down, and I've gone on to attend other residential advocacy courses, such as I've done 2 in Florida, for civil and also for criminal. And in January this year, I went to Melbourne for their advanced advocacy course, which was just fantastic. And finally, I should probably add that I've attended a specialist cross-examination clinic with Roger Dodd, who's co-authored a magnificent book called Cross-Examination, the Science of Techniques. And I'm also a trainer at the Inn. And all of these experiences together have helped me develop my own skills and improve what I do in court. It's raised the game for me. I'm now doing more complex cases. It also means that my opponents are a lot more scary now. An example is next week I'm leading a junior in a case where there are 2 silks against me, and it's completely frightening and not something that I would have thought about doing before. But now my aspirations are higher, and I can actually see myself making that application for silk. Whether or not I get it is another story, but it's instilled a confidence in me which makes a huge difference, which I didn't see about five years ago. And what I have learned in terms of advocacy has also led me to want to share it, because I know that other people might not have the time or the funds to do week-long courses in England or around the world. So I'm currently in the process of interviewing silks and their counterparts from around the world about what makes them so good, and creating a podcast on advocacy technique, which launches in January 2021. So again, I've learned so much from this project and everything else that I've learned, which I feel has really made a difference to my practice as a barrister, but also as a Black female barrister. So really, to sum up, I think I would say that my experience as a Black woman at the family bar within chambers has generally been positive. I have had some horrible experiences, but thankfully they've been few and far between. But I must say that I've had to do a lot of work outside of the role of being a barrister. And I put this down to what my mum told me when I was quite young, that as a Black girl, I'm going to have to work twice as hard to get half of the recognition. And I suspect that she is right, because I don't think that I would be in the position that I'm in if I hadn't worked as hard as I did. And what I've also learned from that is that I cannot be passive, and I create opportunities for myself, such as my own diversity research project, or going forward and training myself in advocacy and meeting people who could help me, and then looking at ways of sharing that with others. And really, I suppose, as a ending sentence, is that the opportunities are there and available for people that look like me, or may not look like me, or may have similar difficulties that I had when I was coming up at the bar. The door isn't shut, but it's about knowing where that door is. And part of the work that I want to do, I am doing, and I want to continue doing, is highlighting the opportunities, especially for Black, Asian and ethnic minority members of the bar and people from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds, and highlighting where those doors are and where they can make a difference as well. Because I do think that this is a career, whilst it's not perfect, that you really can move forward in. So thank you, and that's my talk.
So thank you very much to Master Badejo for that brilliant and inspiring talk. It was so positive, and gave us some really excellent practical tips. So our next speaker is an academic, Professor Ayola Solanki, who is chair of the European Union Law and Social Justice within the University of Leeds Law School. She's a former visiting professor at the Harvard University School of Public Health and the Fernand Braudel Fellow at the European University Institute. She's the author of EU Law, published by Pearson, also Making Anti-Racial Discrimination Law, published by Routledge in 2011, and Discrimination as a Stigma, a Theory of Anti-Discrimination Law, published by Hart in 2017, as well as many articles in peer-reviewed journals. Professor Solanki is an academic venture of the Inner Temple and founder of the Black Females Professors Forum, which promotes the visibility, which is a theme that keeps coming up, and progress of Black women in academia. She recently chaired the inquiry into the history of eugenics at UCL. So I'm going to hand you over to her. She'll speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll finally have 10 minutes for questions. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box now. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Judith. Hi, good morning, everybody. And thank you to everybody at Inner Temple for organising this event. So I think you've all been blessed this morning with some wonderful interventions from Masters Kadri, Leslie and Badeja. So I feel I have a hard task. I've got a lot to live up to, and I'm also aware that you've been listening now for some time, so I'll try not to take too long with my comments. And actually, fortunately, a lot of what I wanted to say has already been said. So I won't say much about my personal journey. I'll perhaps focus on my comments on talking about my experiences as a legal academic. But just to begin with an overview then perhaps of my personal journey. As I said, there are many parallels with what you've already heard this morning. My parents also came from a former colony or Commonwealth country, Nigeria. They actually left Nigeria before it became independent to come to pursue studies here in England. Like Master Kadri, my father was a lawyer and experienced some of the same challenges of success that you've heard from Master Kadri, so I won't repeat those here. And my mother trained as a midwife and also had her own experiences with racism in the National Health Service. Like Master Leslie, I grew up in West London, although I'm speaking to you this morning from Leeds, where the sun has just come out, so it's a lovely morning. I grew up in an area very, very close to Grenfell Tower. In fact, I went to school just around the corner from Grenfell Tower. My primary school is visible. Grenfell Tower is visible from my primary school, so that region is very close to my heart. It's where I had my many formative experiences. I also went to school in White City. I attended a comprehensive that was quite a large comprehensive on Wood Lane. While I was there, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life. I do remember taking various or using various computer packages that they had developed in those days to identify what your personality traits were and what your skills were as a guide to what type of career you should pursue. And I remember that when I did use these packages, the conclusions were quite diverse. So according to these packages, I should either become a writer or an astronaut. Academia didn't feature in these packages, and it's quite a funny story how I did come to academia. But before I get to that, just to draw another parallel with what Master Leslie said, or Master Thomas, I'm not sure why I'm calling him Master Leslie, Master Thomas said, life in the 70s and the 80s remained very tough for Black families, and in particular young Black men. I remember my brother also being arrested regularly or being profiled on the street, just as Master Thomas explained. And also, although I didn't personally experience racist career advice, my older sisters certainly did. Being told, for example, as Master Thomas mentioned, being told to lower their sights, maybe. So I had an older sister who wanted to become a scientist and did ultimately become a scientist, but was instead advised to think about teaching as a profession. But I was lucky. I was encouraged to go to university, as we all were, at school and also by my family. And at university, I had a very good personal tutor who suggested that I take a PhD. But at that time, the only academics that I had seen in my 3-4 years at university were mostly older white men. And that did have an impact on me because it made me think that wouldn't be a vocation for me. It wouldn't be a place where I would feel comfortable or welcome. It was only 10 years later, when I was doing my master's at the LSE, that my dissertation supervisor, the wonderful Catherine Rake, who went on to lead the Fawcett Society for a while, again suggested that I do a PhD. And at that time, perhaps because I was a bit older, I was maturer, but also perhaps because I did see a few more women, white women. I hadn't yet met any Black female academics. But at that time, I thought, okay, well, maybe this is something that I could take seriously. And I decided to pursue it. I was, again, very lucky in that I met two wonderful academics in the law school at the LSE, one of whom will be familiar to some of you. Master Nicola Lacey was one of my dissertation supervisors, and also Professor Damien Chalmers. They were the best supervisors that I could have asked for. They supported me, they nurtured me, they mentored me, and they also gave me opportunities, the opportunities that I needed to secure my first academic position. Which I did just before I completed my PhD. My PhD was a socio-legal study, and what I did was write about the evolution of anti-racial discrimination law in the United Kingdom, in Germany, and the European Union. So my academic career has really been focused on looking at themes linked to the European Union and linked to discrimination. I began working at the University of Leeds in 2010, and I was promoted to professor in 2016. So that's really all I'm going to say about my background and my journey. As Masters Kadri, Thomas, and Badejo have also said, the key elements, I would say, are perseverance, luck, as I've mentioned, and as Master Badejo just mentioned, taken on a lot of outside work and creating my own opportunities. And one of the key opportunities that, or one of the key pieces of luck, I think, that I had quite early in my career was coming into contact with the Inner Temple. I received a letter from the then, I can't remember his title, but Anthony Dursey, some of you will remember him, the wonderful Anthony Dursey. I received a letter from him telling me about these academic fellows that were being created by the Inner Temple. Now, I don't come from a traditional legal background. I don't have a traditional law degree. My first degree was in German and drama, so I've travelled. I'm an intellectual journey maker. But at the time, I thought, you know, I do want to do more to bring young Black students into the legal academy. And this idea of the academic fellow, of being able to work as a kind of bridge between the academy and the bar and the inns, really appealed to me. So I applied, and I was fortunate to become one of the first academic fellows appointed in 2010. And that really has been key to my success, because the work that I was able to do with Inner Temple in those 6 years between 2010 and 2016 not only gave me personal exposure and really gave me an education by exposing me more to the practical everyday work of a barrister, but it really helped me to bring more young Black minority ethnic students into the law school at Leeds, to not only give them an idea of what studying law might be like, but also to make the environment of a law school less alien, less mythical to them. And I really enjoyed that work. And I also then started working with the Temple Women's Forum. And together with lawyers in the Northeast, in particular Taryn Lee, we created a northern equivalent, the Temple Forum, the Temple Women's Forum North, because it was clear to me that I couldn't always come down to London for the events from Leeds. So I thought, well, why not bring events to Leeds? And that worked quite well. So over the last 5 or 6 years, we began in 2013, we've been able to bring up some wonderful speakers from London, but also bring speakers, senior judges, female judges from the northern region into the law school. And that again has brought practitioners into contact with students. We have a very diverse student population in Leeds, so that's also helped me to fulfill that goal of encouraging more young Black scholars, and in particular young Black and minority ethnic female scholars, to think about a career at the bar. So in 2016, I became one of the first Black female professors at the University of Leeds. We currently have 2 Black female professors. There's myself and a colleague in science. And when I became a professor, I suddenly thought, my goodness, where are all of my counterparts? And I began a project to try to identify where are the Black female professors in the United Kingdom. Now, I wasn't using Black in the narrow morphological sense. I was using Black in the more political sense. So I was also looking at professors, or I was also trying to identify professors who were Asian or minority ethnic. Excuse me, I have a bit of a frog in my throat this morning, but not COVID, I hope. So you've heard a lot already about where the legal profession is. And what I want to talk about now is where we are today in the legal academy. As with the bar, there have been significant changes, but there is still some way to go. At present, just thinking about professors for the moment, many universities do not have a single Black female professor or even Black male professor. And this is across the board in all disciplines, in all schools, in all subjects. So there are students at our universities, Black and minority ethnic students at our universities, who have no opportunity to see somebody who looks like them doing the work of teaching, of developing knowledge, of disseminating knowledge as being an intellectual authority. And I wonder, I have to question what that does to their experience. Some universities will have one Black female professor, and there are perhaps a handful that have more than one. So there really is a dearth of Black female professors in the United Kingdom. And I created a forum in 2017 to give us more visibility, but also to work with universities to find out what the sticking points were. And that's a complicated question because, of course, you don't just become a professor overnight. You become a professor by going through the academic system. So what I want to do now is talk about some of the challenges at every level of academia, starting at the undergraduate level. So it's generally the case that in order to pursue postgraduate studies, you need a 2:1 or higher. At present, there is what is called an awarding gap at the undergraduate level. So the most recent data demonstrates that there is, across the United Kingdom, an awarding gap of 13.2%. That means that I have to say this properly so that you understand the statistics. There is an awarding gap of 13.2% between BAME students and white home or European Union undergraduate students achieving a 2.1 or a first degree. There is work going on to understand why that gap exists, but there is no clear answer yet. Worse still, when we are talking about African and Caribbean students, that gap of students achieving a 2.1 or a first widens to 25.9%. Why is that so? As I said, we still don't really know. But one reason might be because there are still challenges in the campus environment for students. So over the past few years, we've seen experiences, or we've heard about the experiences of Black students at universities. Just last week or a few days ago, there was the terrible incident of the racist profiling of a young Black student at the University of Manchester by a security guard who thought that he looked like a drug dealer and actually didn't want to believe him when he presented his student ID card to them. A few years ago, there were events at the University of Nottingham-Trent where students were being taunted with bananas and being called monkeys. So one reason for this awarding gap might be simply because the environment is still somewhat hostile to undergraduate students. Universities are trying to tackle this, but more needs to be done there. So it might be that the environmental challenges are indeed impacting students in their ability to settle into their studies. So there are structural things that need to change in order, I think, to enable Black and minority ethnic students to perform to the best of their abilities. Moving on then, for those Black and minority ethnic students who do successfully graduate with a 2.1 or a first, what happens when they apply to pursue graduate studies? Again, this has recently become an issue that has been taken up by the Office for Students and Research England, and there is now funding available to introduce schemes to improve the figures at this level of study. So the UK Council for Graduate Education conducted a study on this a few years ago, and they discovered that the proportion of BAME students enrolled in higher education at the undergraduate level drops from 24% to 18% at postgraduate level. An organisation called Leading Roots published a report called The Broken Pipeline, and they discovered that in the academic year 2017-2018, there were a total of 15,500 full-time UK domiciled PhD students in their first year of study. Only 3% of those students were Black. Funding is a big issue at the postgraduate level. And in over 3 years, just 1.2% of the almost 20,000 studentships awarded by UK Research and Innovation, which is the umbrella body for research councils such as the ESRC and the AHRC, only 1.2% of the almost 20,000 studentships that they offered went to Black or ethnic minority students. And only 30 of those were from a Black Caribbean background. So funding is a significant issue, but it goes beyond that. There was an investigation conducted by some BBC journalists a few weeks ago, and they presented their results on Newsnight. And they discovered in relation just to PGR applications, so applications to enroll for a PhD, Black applicants were far less likely to succeed. And in one example, they discovered that There were 8,000 offers for white candidates, but only 386 for those who were Black. So in addition to the awarding gap at the undergraduate level, there are also the challenges of enrolling for and affording studies at the postgraduate level, whether that be a taught postgraduate program or more specifically a research postgraduate program, because increasingly the only way into legal academia or academia in general is through a PhD. So let's assume that, like me, you're fortunate enough to meet the right people and have the right support to get onto a PhD program and to successfully complete that PhD program. And then you become an early career researcher and you're looking for your first post. Then we come up against recruitment practices. Unfortunately, what is visible is that BAME applicants are significantly less likely to be interviewed, shortlisted, and appointed to any post. So getting into academia is very challenging in the United Kingdom. If you do getting to the senior levels is again very difficult. And again, the data shows that Black and minority ethnic applicants are not only less likely to apply for promotion, but are also less likely to be successful. So there is it's a pipeline issue, essentially, is the short answer as to why there are so few Black female professors. But in addition, there are a number of challenges that arise during your working life in legal academia. And there are a number of reports that have also highlighted this over the last few years. So there is still racism in legal academia, in academia in general, in fact, but these are now more subtle, which is something that Master Thomas also mentioned. There are microaggressions, there's politeness, which is actually racist. There is a sense that people are listening to you and smiling, but actually nothing changes. Opportunities are withheld. It's impossible to talk about race and racism. There's a sense that power and white privilege is maintained throughout all levels of academia. Despite many policies in equalities, diversity and inclusion, there is still significant structural racism. And that is seen in the recruitment procedures that I've mentioned, and also in things like promotions. So sometimes it's very rare now to find 100% female panel for anything in academia, recruitment or promotion. But it's still very common to face all white panels. So that's something that I think needs to be addressed in academia. It's still difficult to talk about issues of racism. Master Badejo mentioned that she was able to discuss racism with her colleagues. But in academia, where you are perhaps the only one in the whole university, it's very difficult. It feels precarious to talk about racism. And oftentimes, if you raise an issue of racism, you become the problem. And in some cases, as these research studies have shown, action is then taken to oust you rather than the perpetrator, which reflects something that Master Kadri said at the beginning of this event. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission recently conducted a survey on racial harassment in higher education, and their findings corroborate the findings of earlier research that often racial harassment is experienced not just by students from other students, but also by staff from other staff, whether those staff be junior at the same level or indeed senior. And that, of course, has an impact on the confidence to apply for promotion and also the likelihood of success at promotion. So I'll stop there. I can answer any questions if we still have time to do that. But just to summarize on issues of race and the academy, or the legal academy, there are a number of institutional and structural issues, less likely to get the necessary grades at the undergraduate level, less likely to find the necessary funding at the postgraduate level, less likely to get appointed to your first post, and less likely to be given the support that you need and access to the opportunities required in order to be promoted. And just a final statistic for you, there is only one Black female head of a law school in the United Kingdom. In, yes, 2020, there is just one Black female head of a law school in the United Kingdom. And one thing we need to think about is how to generate more. We can't just go through the next decades relying on luck and doing everything for ourselves. So I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that really, really concise and well explained sort of view of academia. I think, well, I hope that all universities are having the discussion. Certainly it's a discussion that's going on in my university, but it's really important, I think, that we talk about it, and perhaps we need to have another roundtable where we specifically look at the academy. But thank you very much for that. Really, really depressing figures, but I think none of us are surprised by them at all. There's one question in the chat bar. So this is for you. It says, what does the lack of diversity mean for the accuracy of perspective and learning coming out of university departments, not only visibility and representation?
Thank you, Isabel. That's an excellent question. So, as I mentioned, many universities, almost all universities now will have equality, diversity and inclusion policies, equality and policy units that will try to improve diversity within the institution. But oftentimes, I think we don't explain enough why this diversity is important, and it's precisely for the reason that you highlight here. Diversity is not important for diversity's sake, but it's important for the impact that it has on the knowledge that is produced, on the information that is presented to students who are ultimately, we hope, going to become future politicians, future lawyers, future leaders. I always think to myself, well, I have to teach my students well, because they might be making decisions on my pension. So we have to expose students to a wide perspective of information and knowledge and critique, in order to enable them not only to understand different perspectives, but to be able to develop their own critical perspective. However they choose to develop it, they should be given a broad range of information upon which to form their own opinions. And we are not doing enough of that in academia. It's something that is being challenged now and being tackled now under the rubric of decoloniality. But decoloniality doesn't just focus on the materials that we place before our students. It also focuses on the personification or the embodiment of knowledge, so the faculty that we place before our students. And it also touches upon, as I mentioned earlier, the environment within which we are teaching our students. Somebody mentioned normalization. I think it was Master Badajo. There is still not enough normalization of the Black and minority ethnic presence in higher academia, whether that be in terms of scholarship and material, or in terms of faculty, or in terms of professional services. And that's something that has to change, so that diversity really is tackled in a holistic way. And when we do that, then there will be not just more accuracy, but also more interest in the perspectives and the learning that we present to our students, and that they can then take with them into the world. Because of course, the learning isn't going to stop once they leave university. They have to be prepared not only for what they're going to meet in the world, but also to make a contribution to that world. So the lack of diversity has huge long-term consequences for us all. I mean, let's take, for example, COVID-19. There's very little research in this country on the response of Black and minority ethnic communities to pandemics and emergencies. And that left us in a very weak position in addressing COVID-19 when this pandemic first arose, because the government didn't know how to develop policies that would speak to and reflect the needs of those communities. And that was a very dangerous situation for us to be in. Thankfully, there is now more attention being paid to that area, but that is a consequence of the lack of diversity in higher education. We simply do not have the expertise we need when we are making policy, especially during emergency periods.
Thank you. There's another question. Are there any studies of impact in the follow-up to students who do succeed in accessing the law? What was it that assisted or motivated their journey?
I'm not sure that there are any specific studies in relation to Black and minority ethnic students, other than that which Master Badajo just mentioned. And I think she highlighted that visibility was really important. And I think that is also true for higher education. You're more likely to just be able to imagine yourself in a particular role if you can see others who look like you in that role, which is one reason why the absence of Black minority ethnic judges in the senior levels of the judiciary is something that we really need to tackle. In terms of what assisted and motivated me on my journey, what assisted me were mentors who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself, and who not only supported me by reading my work and commenting on it, but also by providing opportunities for me. That was so important. What motivated me? Well, I suppose what motivated me personally was a desire to really understand racial discrimination. That's what took me into the Legal Academy, and that's still my work now. I still want to make the world a better place for Black and minority ethnic people.
So we are out of time. So I think perhaps we will end it there. It's very frustrating that we can't go off and have lunch and actually extend these conversations and debates over food. But it's very interesting that really both of you have spoken about really role models, and certainly in my project on women in law, some of the criticism was that that you shouldn't shine a spotlight on individual women because you were setting up these unattainable role models. Whereas my argument has always been is that it's very important to see people in your own image that you can follow. Everybody is flawed, you know, we all have multifaceted, but you do need to see somebody that you can follow in their footsteps. It's very hard if you see yourself as the first. So thank you for addressing that. Thank you both, and our other speakers who are in court today. Thank you very much for participating. It has been a fantastic morning, lots of issues. There are things that I'm sure we could all talk about for hours, but I think the thing to take away from this, really inspiring. Thank you very, very much. I hope the rest of the delegates will join us this afternoon for the history part of this session. But it just leaves me to thank the Inn very much, and to again thank our panelists, and to thank all of you who have attended. Thank you.
Thank you.